August 14, 1959, 8:40 p.m. The summer heat still clung to Harlem like a damp blanket, and the streetlights along West 126th Street flickered to life one by one. Storefronts were closing, radios hummed through open windows, and the neighborhood moved with its usual nighttime rhythm. Bumpy Johnson walked beside his wife, Mamie, his pace unhurried, his posture calm. To most people passing by, he looked like just another well-dressed man enjoying an evening stroll. But Harlem knew better. When Bumpy Johnson walked, the street usually made room. Mamie held her handbag close, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She was used to the looks, some respectful, some curious, some fearful. Being Bumpy Johnson's wife meant living under a constant, invisible spotlight. Still, this was Harlem, their Harlem. Bumpy had walked these blocks for decades. He believed certain lines were understood. Family was one of them. They were less than half a block from their car when the air shifted. Bumpy felt it before he saw it. A sudden hush. A pause in the street's natural noise. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement, too fast, too deliberate. 3 men stepped out from between 2 parked cars. Not teenagers, not drunks. Their coats were too neat, faces too hard. Even in Bumpy, one of them said, his voice carrying a thin smile. Bumpy stopped, slowly. His hand tightened just slightly, but he didn't reach for anything. He knew this kind of moment. Power wasn't always about speed. Sometimes it was about stillness. "Keep walkin'," he said calmly, without raising his voice. That was when it happened. Before Bumpy could shift his weight, one of the men grabbed Mamie by the arm and yanked her backward. Her handbag fell, spilling its contents onto the sidewalk. She gasped, the sound sharp and sudden, and the street seemed to inhale with her. Another man struck her across the face, once, hard. The crack echoed louder than a gunshot in that quiet second. "Don't," Bumpy said. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. They ignored it. A second blow landed, then a third. Mamie stumbled, trying to shield herself, her knees buckling as she cried out. People across the street froze in place. Some turned away. Others watched, terrified, knowing exactly who was standing there and what this moment meant. Bumpy didn't rush them. He didn't pull a weapon. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, placing himself between his wife and the men. His face showed no panic, no rage, only something colder, something heavier. His eyes locked onto each attacker, memorizing them, carving their faces into his mind. "That's enough," he said. One of the men laughed nervously, backing away. "Just sending a message?" he muttered. Bumpy knelt beside Mamie as the men retreated into the darkness, their footsteps quick and uneven. He lifted her gently, his hand steady despite the fury boiling inside him. Blood marked her lip, her breathing trembled, but she was conscious. Alive. "I'm here," he said softly to her, his voice low so only she could hear. Around them, Harlem remained silent, no cheers, no sirens. Just the understanding that something sacred had been violated. Bumpy looked up once more, scanning the street, committing the moment to memory. This wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration of war, and everyone who witnessed it knew one thing for certain: Harlem would never be the same again. The attackers were gone within seconds, swallowed by the shadows between buildings, but the damage they left behind lingered in the air. The street slowly exhaled again. Radios resumed. A car engine turned over. A distant siren wailed somewhere far off, but no one moved toward Bumpy and his wife. Fear held the neighborhood in place. Everyone understood what they had just witnessed, and more importantly, what it meant. Bumpy helped Mame to her feet and guided her toward the car. His movements were careful, almost tender, as if the world around them had narrowed to just the two of them. A shopkeeper quietly unlocked his door and offered a chair. Another woman pressed a handkerchief into Mamie's palm without saying a word. No one asked questions. No one gave advice. Harlem knew better than to speak when Bumpy Johnson went quiet. He drove her home himself, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting lightly near hers. The city lights slid past the windshield, but Bumpy barely noticed them. His mind replayed the scene again and again, the faces, the voices, the way one of them laughed. He didn't curse. He didn't pound the dashboard. His silence was complete, and that frightened him more than anger ever could. At home, he helped Mamie inside and called a doctor he trusted, someone who knew how to keep his mouth shut. As the doctor worked, Bumpy stood near the window, looking out at the dark street below. Men passed by unaware they were walking through the calm before a storm. When the doctor finished and quietly left, Mamie reached for Bumpy's hand. "Don't," she whispered, reading the weight in his eyes. He squeezed her fingers gently. "I won't let this stand," he said. His voice was calm, almost soft. That was worse than a shout. By 10:15 p.m., the phone began to ring. Bumpy didn't answer the first call, or the second. Word had traveled fast, the way it always did in Harlem. By the third ring, he picked up. "Stay where you are," he told the voice on the other end. "I'll send for you." Within an hour, men began arriving quietly, one at a time. No shouting greetings, no laughter, just nods and lowered voices. They gathered in the back room, the air thick with cigarette smoke and unease. These were men who had seen Bumpy angry before. They had never seen him like this. He didn't raise his voice when he spoke. He didn't pace. He simply told them what happened, exactly as it happened, down to the smallest detail. When he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. They crossed a line. One man finally said. Bumpy nodded. They erased it. Instructions followed. Short sentences, names, streets, times, nothing wasted, no room for misunderstanding. By midnight, Harlem was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. Doors closed. Cars moved quietly through familiar routes. Phones rang in places that preferred not to be called. Some men tried to leave town. Others sought protection from old alliances that suddenly felt very thin. Police patrols increased, sensing tension, but not yet understanding it. Newspaper offices caught whispers, but no facts. Harlem itself seemed to pull inward, waiting. At home, Bumpy sat alone at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the ticking of the clock. His wife slept in the next room. He stared at the wall, not thinking about revenge as emotion, but as consequence. What had happened wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge to the order he had built over decades. And when Bumpy Johnson decided order had been challenged, history showed only one outcome. The city learned the lesson, whether it wanted to or not. By 20:30 a.m., Harlem's back rooms were alive. Lights burned in places that usually stayed dark, and men who avoided each other for years now found themselves sitting at the same tables. Bumpy Johnson had summoned them, not with threats, not with promises, but with a message that carried more weight than either. When Bumpy called, you came, or you accepted the consequences of not coming. The meeting place was a modest apartment above a closed storefront, chosen for its anonymity. One by one, the men arrived, checking the street before knocking, their faces tight with concern. These weren't street-level hustlers. These were lieutenants, intermediaries, men who moved money, territory, and influence. They greeted each other with stiff nods, no small talk, no jokes. Everyone felt it. Something fundamental had shifted. Bumpy entered last. The room fell silent immediately. He removed his hat, set it carefully on the table, and looked around the room. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, settling on each face as if weighing them. No one interrupted. No one dared. "What happened tonight?" he began. "Wasn't business." He let the words sink in. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a mistake. It was a test. A murmur rippled through the room. Some men looked down. Others stared straight ahead, their jaws clenched. Bumpy continued, his voice level. "And tests tell you who's loyal, who's careless, and who's already made up their mind." He gestured to one man near the window. "You." The man stiffened. "I heard rumors earlier this week," he admitted. "Names being passed around. I didn't think. You didn't think," Bumpy repeated calmly. "It's the problem." He turned to another. "Your people control that block." "They do," the man said quickly. "But I swear, boss, this didn't come from me." Bumpy studied him for a long moment. "I believe you," he said at last. The man exhaled in relief. It was short-lived. Bumpy added, "Doesn't erase responsibility." By 1000 a.m., the room had transformed into a web of information. Names surfaced. Old grudges reappeared. A debt from years ago suddenly made sense. It became clear that the attack wasn't random. It was encouraged, quietly supported by men who thought Bumpy was growing old, soft, distracted by politics and poetry. They were wrong. Bumpy listened more than he spoke. He absorbed every detail, every hesitation, every contradiction. He knew Harlem's underworld like a chessboard, and, tonight, pieces were revealing their true positions. At one point, a younger man spoke up nervously. "Boss, if this turns loud, the police'll come down hard." Bumpy looked at him almost kindly. "They're always coming," he said. "That's not new." "What's new?" he continued, as someone forgetting the rules. The instructions that followed were precise and unsettling in their simplicity. No reckless moves. No public displays. Pressure would be applied quietly, business interrupted, protection withdrawn, doors closed. Men would find themselves isolated before they even realized what was happening. By morning, Bumpy said, "I want them nervous. Tomorrow night, I want them alone." The meeting broke up just after 2000 a.m. Men left in silence, each carrying a piece of the plan, each aware that failure would not be forgiven. Outside, Harlem looked unchanged, empty streets, glowing streetlights. Beneath the surface, alliances were cracking. Back at the apartment, Bumpy remained behind. He poured himself a drink and sat alone, the room heavy with smoke and echoes. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance. About reminding the city that some lines, once crossed, demanded correction. Somewhere across Harlem, men who thought they had made a bold move felt an unease they couldn't explain. Deals stalled. Phones went unanswered. Friends suddenly became distant. They didn't know it yet, but the game had already turned against them, and Bumpy Johnson was several moves ahead. Saturday, August 15th, 1959, just after dawn. Harlem woke up uneasy, as if the neighborhood itself had slept badly. The early morning sounds were there, the clatter of milk bottles, the rumble of delivery trucks, church doors creaking open. But something underneath felt wrong. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when certain names were mentioned. Shop owners glanced down the street more often than usual. Who normally lingered on corners moved along quickly, eyes forward. News of the attack had spread without newspapers, without radios. It traveled the old Harlem way. Whispers, looks, half-finished sentences. Everyone knew Bumpy Johnson's wife had been attacked. What no one knew was how Bumpy would answer. And that uncertainty was more frightening than any certainty. By 80 a.m., the first signs appeared. A gambling house on Lenox Avenue didn't open. Its door stayed locked, lights off, money trapped inside. Across town, a numbers runner waited for his usual protection escort that never came. Calls were placed, favors were asked. The responses were vague or non-existent. "Not today" became the most common phrase in Harlem. Police patrols noticed it too. Officers who had walked these streets for years sensed the shift immediately. Too quiet, too controlled. This wasn't chaos, it was restraint, the kind that snapped only after careful planning. A sergeant made a note in his book and ordered extra cars into the area. Even he knew uniforms wouldn't stop what was already in motion. By mid-morning, men connected, loosely or tightly, to the previous night's attack began to panic. One tried to book a train out of Grand Central, only to find his cash suddenly gone, frozen by a debt collector who had once owed him favors. Another packed his apartment in a rush, unaware that every move he made was being watched. Harlem businesses felt it next. Suppliers canceled deliveries. Credit disappeared overnight. Doors that had always opened smoothly now stayed shut. No threats were spoken aloud. The message was unmistakable. You were either with Bumpy Johnson or you were on your own. Inside his apartment, Bumpy remained invisible. He didn't appear in public. He didn't make speeches. That absence was deliberate. His power didn't come from being seen. It came from being felt. He sat near the window, listening to reports delivered quietly by men who knew better than to embellish. "Two of them are trying to leave town," one said. "Let them try," Bumpy replied. Another spoke. "The one who laughed, he's asking around for protection." Bumpy nodded once. No one answers him. By noon, Harlem had chosen sides without being asked. Old grudges resurfaced, but this time, no one rushed to settle them. Everyone was watching Bumpy's shadow, trying to guess where it would fall. Mothers pulled their children inside earlier than usual. Store owners closed before sunset. Churches filled more quickly that evening. Prayers whispered for peace that no one truly expected. Even the men who hadn't been involved felt the pressure. That was the point. Bumpy understood something many never did. Fear worked best when it was shared. When everyone felt it, everyone enforced it. Afternoon faded into evening. Word reached the attackers themselves. They learned that allies had gone silent. Money was inaccessible. That familiar streets no longer felt safe. One reportedly broke down, begging a mutual contact to arrange a meeting. Bumpy's response was simple. Tomorrow, Harlem went to sleep Saturday night, knowing the waiting was almost over. Windows stayed dark. Streets emptied early. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed, long and low, like a warning. By the time Sunday approached, it was clear this was no longer about revenge alone. The neighborhood had already changed. Lines were redrawn without ink. Authority had been reaffirmed without a single public act, and everyone understood one thing with absolute clarity. Bumpy Johnson finally chose to step back into the light. Harlem would feel the impact all at once. Sunday, August 16th, 1959, 6:15 p.m. The heat returned in the early evening, heavy and unmoving, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Harlem had been waiting all day. Now, everyone knew something was about to happen, not loud, not reckless, but final. When Bumpy Johnson chose a time, it meant the pieces were already in place. The meeting took place in a quiet social club that usually hosted card games and small talk. Night. It was empty except for a single table and 3 nervous men seated around it. Their confidence from Friday night was gone. Faces were pale. Hands shook when they reached for cigarettes. They had learned, slowly and painfully, what isolation felt like. Bumpy arrived precisely on time. He didn't bring an entourage. Just 2 men who stayed by the door, silent and still. He removed his hat and coat, just as he had done 100 times before, and sat across from them. No one spoke. The ticking of a wall clock filled the room. "You understand why you're here," Bumpy said at last. One man nodded quickly. Another swallowed hard. The third stared at the table, unable to meet Bumpy's eyes. "What you did," Bumpy continued, "wasn't strength. It was ignorance." He leaned forward slightly. "There are rules that keep this city standing. You didn't break them by accident. You broke them because you thought you could." The man who had laughed during the attack finally spoke, his voice cracking. "We didn't think it would go this far." Bumpy's gaze fixed on him. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You didn't think at all." There was no shouting, no threats, just truth delivered with precision. Bumpy laid out the consequences the same way he would outline a business deal. Territories reassigned, operations dissolved, names erased from protection lists. No drama, just removal. "You'll leave Harlem tonight?" he said. "You won't come back." "Not to visit, not to ask favors. If you do, the conversation will be shorter." They understood. This wasn't mercy, but it wasn't chaos either. It was order restored. By the time the meeting ended, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. Word traveled quickly, faster than the attack itself had. The men responsible were gone, stripped of influence, cut off from every network that mattered. No bodies in the street, no headlines. Just absence. That absence spoke louder than violence ever could. In the days that followed, Harlem adjusted. Businesses reopened with renewed confidence. Disputes were settled quietly. Boundaries were respected again. The unspoken rule, family was untouchable, was reinforced without a single public reminder. Bumpy returned home that night and sat beside his wife. Her bruises were fading, but the memory lingered. He held her hand, neither of them speaking. They didn't need to. The message had already been delivered to the city, to its enemies, to anyone watching closely. By Monday morning, Harlem moved differently, straighter, calmer, smarter. Years later, people would talk about that weekend in lowered voices, not because of what they saw, but because of what they didn't. No explosions, no bloodshed, just a shift so absolute that no one ever dared repeat the mistake. And that was how Bumpy Johnson changed Harlem forever, with rage, but with control.